Hi, here's I'm live and welcome to another episode of the Parenting Teens podcast. It is a little different this week. I've got a different background. I'm in an unusual location from my usual podcast, but welcome, and we're going to do this anyway. I am going to have to look at changing the date and the time at which I do this because meetings have changed for me. But let's crack on with today. We are going to talk about parenting teens and what happens when they block getting help. As parents, we've all been aware of those moments when we've got teenagers with stress, anxiety, depression. And as parents, we want to help and support them. But what happens when they put up barriers to getting support? So when teenagers and young adults are stressed, anxious, depressed, overwhelmed, and even suicidal, and they put up barriers to getting help, this is also stressful and frustrating for parents. I know I have been there with my son many years ago, and this went on for years. You can go through all of the effort of getting appointments and have to wait months to actually get them to an appointment, only for them to say, I don't want any help, or I don't need any help, or I'm fine now. And then the next day after the appointment, they crash yet again, or soon after. And once again, you're left dealing with the meltdowns, the tantrums, the depression, the suicidal tendencies. And because they've dismissed help at that appointment, you can't go back and get another one. Where do you go from here? And this is a story I have heard too many times. Almost everybody I speak to with children who are on the autistic spectrum in particular, as well as people with children with other neurodiversities, with other mental health issues, they have all had similar issues with getting appointments, but not receiving the right support. Because no matter how hard as a parent you try, your child can put up barriers. And once they're over about 11 or 12 years old, sometimes even before, those professionals, I use the word lightly there and not to be disrespectful here, but these people who are professionals, they don't connect with that person, that child or teenager during that appointment. If they cannot make a connection with somebody within 10 to 15 minutes to really get them to open up, they're never going to be able to give them the support they need. Now, the problem with children on the autistic spectrum is it takes them a lot longer than usual to open up to somebody. They sometimes have to meet a person repeatedly to feel that they can connect with and trust that person before they will even begin to open up. And therefore, if they can't open up and that professional can't help them within that 15-minute appointment, it's going nowhere. And therefore, we have a whole country and a whole world filled with children who are unable to access the support they need because of their inability to open up in a short appointment that they've waited months for, lost by then the connection for why within themselves and why they needed to go there in the first place. They've also been stressed and anxious about going. And on top of that, they very often feel, even though they struggle with empathy and they find it difficult to read other people's emotions, they can find it difficult. They are naturally aware that as a parent, you're stressed and anxious about that appointment as well. And it's putting pressure on them to perhaps open up when they're not ready to with a stranger as well. So the added pressure from you can also, inadvertently, it's not something you intend, but it can inadvertently put more pressure on them, and the stress actually causes them to close in even more. So how can we help more mature children, teenagers, and young adults who have been going through this pointless process of waiting months for help that is not going to help, or going to repeated appointments that maybe give them something like a traffic light system to breathe when they need to calm down? But what happens when that's no longer effective and they need a new strategy? And there's a next problem that comes along that's a bigger, more complicated problem. Because let's face it, growing up is all about encountering bigger and more complicated problems day in and day out, week on week, year on year. And teenagers of all people have the most problems and challenges and new experiences to work through during those teenage years. Now, when you think of teenagers having just 6 years, technically between 13 and 19, to go from stepping out of childhood into that teen identity, where they've then got all the hormones going on, there's peer pressure at school, there's exams, there could be family issues as well, they could be getting bullied at school, all sorts of things can be going on in their life. And by the time they're 19, at the other end of teens, they could potentially be in college or university or work. They could be in relationships and breakups. They could even be parents. They could be driving, drinking, smoking, voting. And that's all within 6 years. And all of these things that they've got to take on board and experience in life are all big changes. And all of that comes with pitfalls that create massive overwhelm for them when they don't have the right guidance through these processes. And that is where I am taking a new stance on this with my strategy. And it's a stance I took with my son when I realized, now admittedly for my son, he was about 19 years old when I came up with this concept of why he was struggling to manage his emotions. He was completely overwhelmed. He was depressed in such a dark place. He was barely a shell of himself. And I finally realized that being on the autistic spectrum, he couldn't understand his emotions because he couldn't see them. And like many neurodivergent children, teenagers, and adults, he was a visual learner. So having realized this left me with a question of, well, how can I help him to see his world of hidden emotions? And that is where I came up with what I call the emotional cycle diagram. I don't have it with me today because I'm not at home. It will be on my website, which is kreeve.co.uk. There are images of it there on the book Brain Unchained. And you can check previous episodes of the podcast and other videos on my channel to see images of this emotional cycle diagram. And I will also put a link to it in the description afterwards. So I came up with this visual diagram that showed him how to comprehend visually where happy, sad, angry, and depressed were on this diagram, so that instead of feeling completely lost in the darkness of his depression, he could actually see the directions that he needed to take through his emotions to work through things that had made him angry, to work through things that had overwhelmed him and made him sad, and to actually resolve those problems, because that's the only way to get back to being happy. And it gave him the purpose for doing that, to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But it also gave me the tools to have those conversations with him, to inspire him, to motivate him, and the tools to help him talk through those conversations to resolve his challenges along the way. Now, when we go back to talking about children going to therapy and support and psychology and counselling and support groups, they are crucial, don't get me wrong. There are times when they are absolutely crucial. But there are many, many children out there, and teenagers and young adults, I keep saying all these words because they're all important, and adults, where if they haven't understood their emotional cycle first, a lot of that stuff is just incomprehensible and out of reach, or it's a superficial solution. And it resolves whatever is triggering them at that point, but next problem along, where's their resilience for dealing with that? And then they're going back to therapy again, or they're on the waiting list again, having meltdowns again, back on drinking and drugs again. So it's how can we get past this point of counselling and therapy resolving one issue, because that's what a lot of it tends to focus on. Let's pick one issue and work through that. But what about the rest? What about all of the other daily challenges that they will come across for the rest of their life? And this is where I found that as a parent, instead of keep taking my son to any kind of therapy, by me switching into a mentoring role with my son, by actually saying there were strategic times, or, where we said, okay, let's sit down and have a session together where I became the mentor. And even though we didn't literally say it at times, it was very clear that in those moments, I wasn't mum, I was his teacher, and teaching him to understand his emotions and work through his own problems. And then when those conversations completed, whether it was 10 minutes, half an hour, sometimes longer, then I switched back to being mum. And it was important that I identified in how I behaved towards him between those two modes, between those two roles. So it's a bit like people who have a job role where you switch into that job role at work, and then when you come home, you switch back to being the person you're at home. You don't tend to take your home life to work and work life home, because it gets things mixed up, messed up. And it's about doing a similar thing with mentoring. And so that was a really powerful strategy for me, using this diagram and then applying like bugging around in front of me, go away. So then switching into that out of that mentoring role meant that it gave him a space emotionally where he was engaged in what I had to say, but was also opening up to me. And this is the point when we talk about them not opening up easily to somebody in an appointment. You are their parent, and you are the one person that under the right circumstances, they will open up to the most. But if you're finding that they're not, then this is where I have something on my website, which is a course. I have an online course called A Safe Space Talking to Teens. And that teaches you the process of sitting constructively and listening to them. Now, it doesn't have to be at a table, but it can be. It doesn't have to be in a specific space, unless it's somewhere they choose that is a space they feel relaxed and comfortable talking in. It could even be out on a walk, when you're out for a drive in the car. It could be just stepping aside from the crowd somewhere for a moment, wherever you are. But giving them a safe space emotionally for them to open up, very much like in a therapist's office. It's a similar thing, that they allow them to speak without being judgmental, without reprimanding them, without giving their own bias and feedback. And it's about, as a parent, learning that skill to give them that safe space is really important. When they do that, and you use that emotional cycle diagram, which I actually have workshops coming up on. This is going to be a regular thing now, is me holding workshops for how to deep dive into that emotional cycle diagram and use that with teenagers, young adults, or if you're an employer, with people at work, so that you can listen to them in this safe space. So it's how to take that whole diagram and apply that to this conversation that gives you the tools for listening. And when we can do that, we're empowering them to open up and talk, but also to engage both ways in conversation with you. And this is the important part, not talking at them, not them yelling at you, but we want a two-way conversation going where you are both listening to each other. That is the dream that I see for more and more parents and teenagers and young adults, is sitting, having those engaging conversations that resolve challenges, problems, new daily encounters and experiences, so that they can be guided through into adult life by you without the stigma of having to go off, wait months and months and months, and then a stigma of having to go to therapy. Because that's one of the reasons they also block it, is this stigma, which it's something that is still really difficult to get rid of, is the stigma of having to go to therapy. Now, a lot more people are embracing it these days and accepting that it is important, But it's actually gone the other way. But we now have a mental health crisis, supposedly of 1 in 4 people needing mental health support. But if 1 in 4 people need support, but there's only one professional counsellor or psychotherapist for every 292 people, there's a slight shortfall in numbers there. So what if we could help address that number and get that to 1 in 5 or 1 in 6 by parents stepping in and becoming that mentor, providing support for your teenager at the point they need it, when they need it, not months down the line, without the stigma, rebuilding trust and engagement with your teenager, getting them solving their own problems and empowering them to manage their own emotions for life going forward, and having a relationship where whenever they do encounter life experiences that are overwhelming, instead of having to go on the waiting list for months and months on end, you have the toolkit and they have the trust to be able to ring you up and say, Mum, Dad, whoever you are, whether you're a manager, leader, to be able to ring you up or talk to you and say, I'm stuck with something, can you help me? Now that is a powerful concept when we can get them there. Can you imagine a world where instead of teenagers turning to each other for help and the blind leading the blind and them all giving each other the wrong advice, and especially when it starts to get down the route of drugs and drink, and I'll take this will help solve all your problems, let's avoid that, let's not go there. Imagine a world where the teenagers actually, their first thought is, I'll ring my parents. It's not one we usually think about, but do you know what? We can do it. Let's get more teenagers wanting to phone their parents for support. And more parents who are able to sit and listen and guide their own teenagers through all the pitfalls and challenges of growing. So check out all the links. I'm going to end there for today. And the other thing, the last thing I want to bring into this is, yes, parenting teens and young adults can be extremely stressful if you have been through all of this route so far. And if you have, I'm really sorry. It is tough. I've been there and I know the stress and the strain that it puts on you going through that. And especially if you have a child who is on suicidal depression tendencies as well. It's very stressful. But let's add in some strategies for you too, because as parents, when we're stressed and anxious and overwhelmed as well, they absorb that. And that also makes them worried about talking to us. And that was one of the things my son used to say, I don't want to bother you with my problems. Now, I used to say to him, the fact that you have problems is bothering me anyway, whether you talk to me or not. So you might as well talk to me so we can try and resolve them, and then we can both feel less stressed. And that, again, was powerful, getting him to realize that talking to me wasn't adding to my problems. It was actually helping me help him to help both of us. And that helped him to open up to me a lot more as well. But let's get you as a parent less stressed as well. So next week, I'm going to talk about mindfulness, because it is one of the strategies that help me tremendously. I've written a number of books about mindfulness, and again, I have a course on the website, but I will go into that in more detail for next week's topic. So for today, let's be mindful of all of the stress of parenting, how we can start to make changes. Check out the Eventbrite link below to see when my next workshop is coming up for the Emotional Awareness Workshop, which is a 2-hour deep dive into the emotional cycle diagram. And look out for next week's episode and the new time, whatever I'm going to set, new timing for the weekly Parenting Teens podcast. So for today, thank you for checking in and listening to what happens when teenagers block getting help. So whatever experiences you've had, whatever challenges you're going through, drop us a comment below. Please interact and let's help more parents, help more teens, and let's just help everybody all together. Take care till then. Bye-bye.